Risk Management at the Norfolk and Norwich University Hospital, Level 2 Training, Part 1. Welcome to Part 1 of the Trust's Level 2 Risk Management Training. Completion of the following training is required for you to be given access to the Risk module of the Trust's Risk Management System InPhase. You will be required to pass a quiz once you've completed Parts 1 and 2 of the training. Please visit the Risk Management section of the BEAT to access this presentation as a video and as a slide set. The slide set will allow access to links to the embedded videos and documents, along with all materials referenced in the presentation. There are many threats and hazards in healthcare. These are things that could cause risk to patients, visitors, the public and staff, or damage the reputation or success of the NNUH Trust. Some of these threats are obvious, but others require more thought and consideration. However, all threats require us to take the right action at the right time. The Trust has a risk management policy, Trust Docs ID 1041, which outlines the ways in which the Trust is taking action to address risk. We also have the NNUH Risk Management Standard Operating Procedure, which outlines the specific processes that are to be followed in the management of risks. Links to both these documents can be found on the PowerPoint version of this presentation and on the Risk Management page of the BEAT. This presentation covers the content of the Risk Management Policy and SOP and will clarify your role in the risk management process. So, what is risk? The definition of risk from ISO 31000 is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Dr. David Hilson, risk management expert, describes risk as uncertainty that matters. So, uncertain in that it may or may not happen, and matters because it relates to our objectives and what we want to achieve. Therefore, it is really important to be clear about what matters so we can then ask, well, what could stop this from happening? The answer to this question will be our risks that we can then focus on managing effectively. Please note, risks are not things that have happened or things that are happening. These would be referred to as incidents or issues. There are two main types of risk. The first is operational risk, which relates to the way patient care is delivered or the way the trust goes about its business. Then there is strategic risk, which relates to where the trust wants to go, how it is going to get there, and how it is going to sustain what it does. Both risk types will affect the trust's objectives, whether these are corporate or local objectives. Risks can be divided into further groupings, for example, workforce, quality and safety, financial, environmental, and so on. So we've established what risk is. Risk management is the term used to describe the activities required to identify, understand and control exposure to uncertain events which may threaten the achievement of objectives. Risk management is about everyone in the trust working together to prevent risks from becoming reality and taking the correct action to reduce the impact should a risk materialise. When you access this presentation as a set of PowerPoint slides rather than as this video, you'll be able to watch the video embedded here, which is a short introduction to risk management by Dr. David Hilson, a renowned risk expert. So why do we have a risk management system? Well, it is a regulatory requirement for the organisation to have risk management processes in place. Risk management is a key mechanism to provide assurance to the board that management understand the risks to the achievement of objectives and that management are adequately identifying and managing risks. Risk management is a key component of general management practice as it aims to ensure that achievement of objectives is more likely, adverse or damaging effects are less likely, costly rework and firefighting is reduced, capital and resources are utilised more efficiently and effectively, performance is improved, including quality, finance, for example, decision making is much better informed, positive outcomes for stakeholders are increased and our reputation is protected and enhanced. I'd like to touch briefly here on the bow tie model of risk management. As you will see from this slide, the diagram is in the shape of a bow tie, and the risk being illustrated is the risk of losing control of your car. The diagram visualizes this risk in one easy to understand picture. On the left-hand side of the diagram are causes and control measures, and on the right-hand side are controls and consequences. You will see that there are some possible causes of losing control of your car listed. The road surface may be poor, or perhaps your speed is excessive. The risk event itself would be loss of control of the vehicle, and the control barriers would be factors such as speed limits, warning signs, and vehicle safety checks. Defence barriers to lessen the impact should a car crash occur might be seat belts, airbags, anti-crumple car design, and so on. And then we have some possible consequences of this event, from costly repair bills to injury or possibly death. Later on in this presentation, we will look in detail at the language of risk description. But if we were to describe this risk in the format required by the Trust, it would be as follows. If the manner of driving and driving conditions fall below safe standards, then a driver could lose control of their car, resulting in insurance penalties, costly repairs, injury, or possibly death. On this slide, an existing trust clinical risk, the risk of clinical deterioration due to delayed or non-escalation of patient News 2 scores, has been expressed according to the bow tie model. You will see the potential causes on the left of the diagram, so incomplete or inaccurate records, lack of knowledge or confidence, high workload, and so on, and the potential outcomes are listed on the right, so delayed treatment resulting in patient harm or death, second victim staff impact, and potential litigation. The actual risk event is in the centre, unrecognised deterioration. Controls are listed below the diagram, divided into preventative controls, or barriers to the causes, and reactive controls, or mitigations should the risk event occur. Above the diagram, the risk is described using the if-then resulting in convention, which will be explored later on in this presentation. There is a link you can follow on the PowerPoint version of this presentation and on the risk management page of the BEAT, which will take you to a short video further explaining the use of the bow tie model. Although the use of InPhase for risk management is dealt with fully in Part 2 of the Level 2 training, it is useful at this stage to have a look at how the risk expressed in the bow tie diagram on the previous slide translates to an entry on InPhase, the Trust's risk management system. We can see detailed here a risk ID, title, description, ownership, scoring, controls, actions, and a review comment. All of these elements of risk management will be fully explored in this presentation. The diagram on this slide outlines the key stages of the Trust's risk management process, and we will be examining each stage of this process in detail. As mentioned earlier, risk is something that threatens the achievement of objectives, so let's look at objective setting. Strategic objectives are set by the board. Care group objectives are set as part of the annual planning process, and departments and teams have their own objectives, targets, and roles to carry out. Next stage of the risk management process is risk identification, which requires the identification and description of risks that might prevent the Trust from achieving the objectives outlined on the previous slide. Risk is uncertainty, an event that might happen. Risk is not certainty, which involves either an incident, which is an event which has happened, or an issue, which definitely will or is already happening. Issues must be managed, but they do not belong on the risk register or within the risk management process. An issue is a known or existing problem. A risk is a specific event or condition that may occur in the future, which will have an impact if it does occur. On the PowerPoint version of this presentation and on the risk management page of the BEAT, You can follow a link to a short video which will help with deciding if you are dealing with a risk or an issue. Still on the subject of risk identification, risks can be identified from various sources, which can be divided into proactive and reactive. Examples of proactive risk identification are horizon scanning for changes to operating context, for example, the prospect of winter pressures, review of objectives, simulations, for example, a fire drill, national requirements and guidance, NICE guidance, for example, brainstorming, questionnaires, scenario analysis, and risk assessment workshops. Examples of reactive risk identification are as a result of incidents and the outcomes of investigations, following complaints, claims, patient feedback, or health and safety inspections, audit reports, external reviews, or ad hoc assessments. And the table in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide shows some other sources of risk identification and divides them further into internal and external sources. All risks should be given a title that follows the risk of X due to Y convention. There are some examples of acceptable titles on the slide. Risk of non-delivery of ambulance performance requirements due to patient flow constraints. Risk of non-compliance with data protection legislation due to human resource constraint. Risk of cyber attack success due to digital vulnerabilities, and so on. Now we are moving on to look at how to describe a risk. Risk descriptions must tell a convincing story, and every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. We use the language if or because for the beginning of the story, then for the middle of the story, and resulting in for the end of the story to describe risks. The if or because part of the description should capture the cause of the risk. The then part of the description should focus on the event which could occur if the cause happens, and the resulting in part should describe the effect of the event. For example, this may be impact upon strategic objectives, financial loss, reputational damage, quality or patient safety being compromised, operational disruption, legal or regulatory action, and so on. Now, as important as it is to understand how risks should be described, it is also necessary to avoid the types of risk descriptions listed on this slide. I'll give you a minute to read through these, and you can refer to them in the future on the PowerPoint version of this presentation. Over the next 4 slides are examples of well-written risks, all with appropriate titles and all following the if or because, then resulting in format. The risk on this slide relates to entrapment in bed rails and is described thus. If children or adults with atypical anatomy are nursed in beds or on trolleys that do not comply with BSEN 50637/2017, then there is an increased risk of them becoming entrapped within the equipment, resulting in the potential for a variety of injuries, including skin tears and bruising, and in the worst case, entrapment of chest or neck, which could result in death. The next risk example is entitled Risk of Reputational and Regulatory Impact Due to Non-Compliance with the Freedom of Information Act 2000, and the description reads, if the Trust is unable to meet its legislated timescale of 20 working days to respond to Freedom of Information requests, then the Trust may be unable to demonstrate its legal obligations within the Freedom of Information Act 2000, resulting in reputational damage, enforcement notices from regulatory authority, potential financial penalties from the ICO. The pharmacy risk shown on this slide uses because rather than if, as the situation leading to the risk is already present. The risk description is, Because the pharmacy department operates within a physical space that is significantly undersized for the hospital's current and future service demands, then the department may be unable to safely and efficiently manage the supply, storage and distribution of medicines, resulting in delays to patient care, increased risk of medication errors, breaches of regulatory standards and diminished staff well-being. And finally, we have this risk of patient harm due to inadequate training and competency of temporary staff. The risk description reads, if temporary staff deliver care or carry out clinical procedures without the appropriate training and confirmation of competence, then the potential for patients to be harmed by incorrect or inappropriate treatment is increased, resulting in avoidable harm to patients, litigation against the organisation, or public and regulatory reputational damage. The examples over the previous slides can be referred to as and when needed by accessing the PowerPoint version of this presentation. We're now moving on to the next stage of the risk management process, risk analysis and scoring. The purpose of analysing and scoring a risk is to estimate the level of exposure to a particular risk, which will then help to inform where responses to reduce or manage the risk can be taken. In assessing how significant the risk of an event occurring is, you will need to do the following. Identify who is affected, patient, staff, organisation. Identify what the potential impact would be should the risk event occur. Identify the most likely consequence or how bad the impact would be. Estimate the likelihood or probability, so how likely the event is to occur, and score the trust exposure to that risk. The analysis of risk should take into account any evidence available from internal or external audits, near misses, incidents, complaints, inspections, and so on. Risks are scored using a 5+5+5 risk scoring matrix, as shown on this slide, with the risk scores taking account of the consequence and likelihood of a risk occurring, along with an assessment of the effectiveness of existing controls. The use of this matrix will be explained over the following slides. There are 3 separate risk scores required for each risk. Firstly, the inherent or initial risk rating. This is an evaluation of the consequence and likelihood of a risk occurring as if no plans exist to control, mitigate or reduce the risk. Secondly, the residual or current risk rating. This score will represent the current existing level of risk, taking into account the current controls in place. And finally, the target risk rating. This is the ultimate level of risk that is realistically achievable within the resources available when planned additional actions and controls have been implemented. In other words, the forecasted position of the risk, taking into account successful delivery of all existing controls and further actions. When scoring a risk, first you will need to evaluate the consequence score. There are 5 descriptors: negligible, low, moderate, major, and catastrophic. Identify which of these is the most likely should the risk event occur. You will need to refer to the detailed consequence description shown over the next 2 slides. Here and on the next 2 slides are the detailed consequence descriptors which you will need to use when deciding on a consequence score. These descriptors can be found in the risk management policy and in the risk scoring matrix document, both available on Trust Docs and accessible via the risk management page of the BEAT. The risk consequence description table is continued on this and the next slide. This is the final section of the risk consequence descriptors. Once you have decided on your risk's consequence score, you will need to evaluate the likelihood score. There are 5 likelihood descriptors: remote, unlikely, possible, likely, and almost certain. Use the table on this slide to support your evaluation of the likelihood of the risk occurring. This table can also be found in the risk management policy and in the risk scoring matrix document. When you are trying to decide whether to score a risk in terms of likelihood or frequency, consider the type of risk event you're assessing. In other words, is it something that occurs with some degree of frequency, or is it something that hasn't yet occurred but there is a likelihood of it occurring? Frequency scoring, in other words daily or weekly, should be used to describe those risks where there is quantitative evidence to demonstrate regularity of events. This scoring is objective. Likelihood scoring, in other words possible, likely, should be used to describe those risks where frequency doesn't make sense. For example, the risk of failing to deliver an annual target. Likelihood scores are more subjective. The third dimension of the scoring process is the evaluation of the effectiveness of existing risk controls. There are 5 levels of effectiveness to choose from: fully effective, largely effective, partially effective, planned but not in place, and absent. Do please remember that for the risk's current score, you are assessing the effectiveness of currently existing controls. Further necessary controls should be identified in the risk action plan. The document ISO 31010 from 2019, Risk Assessment Techniques, notes that when assessing controls, organisations should consider existence, so is the control actually in place? Design effectiveness, is the control well designed to manage the specific risk? Operating effectiveness, is the control implemented correctly and working as intended? Documentation and communication, is the control documented and understood? Monitoring, is it subject to review or audit? So you need to be asking, are controls clearly defined? Are they being followed? And do they work in practice? Finally, you need to add together the consequence score, the likelihood score, and the control effectiveness score to calculate the overall risk score. So, for example, if your consequence score is 3, so moderate, your likelihood score is 4, which translates to likely, and your control effectiveness is 3, partially effective, then your overall risk score will be 10, which puts this into the serious risk bracket. In the PowerPoint version of this presentation, there is a link to a short video explaining the use of the 5+5+5 scoring methodology. This was discussed earlier in the presentation, but just a reminder that there are 3 separate risk scores required for each risk: the inherent or initial risk rating, the residual or current risk rating, and the target risk rating. And just a word of caution here, please do ensure that your current risk score is accurately assessed. Please avoid overinflating risk scores in the hope that a higher score might attract funding. The scoring of all risks that are added to the risk register is moderated by the risk management team and at a number of meetings where risks are discussed. I'd now like to show you how all this risk scoring theory translates into practice. On this and the following slides are some snapshots from InPhase of aspects of an actual risk that is on the Trust's risk register. You will see that the risk title follows the Trust's risk naming convention, so risk of delays to gyno-oncology procedures due to theatre capacity and equipment constraints. Then we have the risk description, which uses the correct language of if, then, resulting in. If gynae-oncology procedures cannot be scheduled or proceed as planned due to constrained theatre capacity, equipment availability, and other resource limitations, then there is a risk that patients will experience delays to diagnostic or therapeutic procedures, resulting in breaches of cancer pathways and potential impact on patient outcomes. The snapshot of the scoring matrix on this slide shows the following. The inherent or initial consequence score, that is to say the score before existing controls have been taken into account, has been calculated at 4, which in terms of patient harm is defined as causing permanent harm to patients. The inherent likelihood score has been calculated at 4 also, which translates to likely or expected to occur at least weekly. The inherent control effectiveness score will always be 5, as the inherent score is the score before any existing controls are taken into consideration. If there are no controls, they cannot be effective. On this slide, you will see that some controls are identified as being in existence to mitigate this risk. Once the existing controls were taken into consideration, the current score was calculated, as in the matrix image. You can see that the consequence score has remained the same. However, the likelihood score has been reduced to 3, that is, possible or expected to occur at least monthly. This reduction is due to the controls that are in place. The effectiveness of the controls has been judged to be largely effective, and therefore the control effectiveness score is 2. The overall current risk score combines the 3 scoring elements, adds them together, to make a total of 9, which makes this a moderate risk. Once the planned actions around this risk are completed, it is forecast that the score will be reduced to 7, as per the target score calculation shown in the matrix. The planned action currently attached to this risk is decision to invest paper to be developed with support of business support team, but it is expected that other actions will be added to further mitigate the risk as time progresses. From the scoring matrix on the slide, you can see that the likelihood score has been reduced to 2, which is unlikely or expected to occur at least annually. The target control effectiveness score of 1 indicates that planned actions have become controls and that it is hoped that at this stage the controls in place will be fully effective. And here is an overview of the risk we have been examining as it appears on InPhase. Now for just a quick word on risk appetite and tolerance. Risk appetite refers to the level of risk an organisation or individual is willing to accept to achieve its or their objectives. It reflects the balance between potential benefits and the likelihood of harm. Risk tolerance, on the other hand, refers to the boundaries of acceptable outcomes in relation to appetite. While appetite defines the desired level of risk exposure, tolerance recognises that some risks may remain outside appetite but are temporarily accepted or tolerated because the cost, resources or feasibility of bringing them within appetite would be disproportionate. For example, we might have a higher risk appetite for innovative research projects, understanding that some degree of failure is possible. However, our tolerance for risks affecting patient safety is low, requiring robust mitigation measures. And then, from an individual's perspective, consider driving to work during severe weather. You may have a low appetite for risk and decide to avoid unnecessary trips. However, if you do choose to drive, your risk tolerance might include driving below the speed limit and avoiding certain routes to stay within your personal, acceptable, safe limits. So the next stage in the risk management process is identifying controls. International Standard 31000 defines a control as a measure that modifies risk. This includes any process, policy, device, practice, or other actions which are designed to alter risk, typically by reducing the likelihood or consequence of a risk event. Controls do not eliminate risk entirely, but they modify it. In other words, the risk will typically still exist, but to a lesser extent with the control applied. You will need to identify the controls that are already in place to reduce the likelihood of the risk happening or to reduce the consequence of it should it happen. When you are identifying controls, these must already be in place. Any controls to further reduce risk which are not in place should be addressed within your action plan. Once an action has been completed, it becomes a control. Control descriptions need to be explicit yet concise in order to provide management or the trust committee or board with enough detail to understand how they link with the risk. Examples of controls can include policies and procedures, people, for example, a person who may have a specific role in the delivery of an objective, training, PPE, processes and practices, access restriction, alarms, audits, standardized clinical protocols and guidelines, second person checks, isolation protocols, equipment maintenance schedules, or business continuity and emergency plans. Once you have identified your controls, you will need to consider how effective these are and whether there are any weaknesses, in other words, gaps in control. Consider what controls may be missing that should be implemented and would help to manage the risk. These should be addressed in your action plan. Next in the risk management process is the identification of assurances. Assurances provide us with information or evidence about the effectiveness of our controls. Assurances can be from a range of sources and will include internal assurances, for example, a clinical audit, and/or external assurance, for example, a report from a regulatory body. Assurances can be positive or negative, meaning that the assurance can indicate whether our controls are working well or whether we need to make further improvements. It should be made clear whether each assurance is positive or negative. Some examples of assurance. A report on training uptake statistics will tell us whether our training uptake is reaching those intended, ideally with pass rates where available. A report on adverse incident reports will tell us whether our policies, procedures and processes are working effectively and without incident. An audit will tell us whether we are compliant with relevant requirements, which, for example, could be our local policies or a national mandate. Good assurance is confidence backed by sufficient evidence. The board will seek to obtain assurance that risks are properly controlled and that strategy is being implemented successfully and sustainably. Identifying actions is a very important part of the risk management process, as it is only by taking action that further controls can be put in place to mitigate a risk. Actions will need to be identified where gaps in control or negative assurances exist. Actions should always include responsible leads and timescales. Completion of actions should strengthen existing controls or add new controls that reduce the likelihood of risk materializing or the impact or consequence if it does. The action plan should provide a clear map of the journey from current to target score. As with the risk assessment itself, an individual must be identified to lead on each action and will be required to provide periodic updates on the actions until it is implemented. The risk owner must always communicate to the nominated action owner that they have been given an action. This should never come as a surprise. The risk owner is responsible for ensuring action owners provide regular updates on the progress of their actions and complete them in a timely manner. It is important to ensure actions follow the SMART methodology. They should be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-framed. Throughout this presentation, you've been given glimpses of how risks appear on the InPhase system. On this slide, you will see again how all the elements of the risk assessment process come together and appear on the risk landing page of InPhase. From this view, it is possible to see from a glance that all areas of the risk form have been completed appropriately. Review and action deadlines can also be monitored from this view. Please note that risks must adhere to the format as outlined in these slides and in the risk management SOP and policy, or they will not be accepted onto the risk register. Compliance with the risk management policy and risk management SOP is monitored by the risk team. Now we move on to risk reporting and escalation, which is the final stage of the risk management process. When you are creating a risk assessment, there are various approval stages it will need to go through before being added to the risk register. The flowchart on this slide outlines the stages risks go through according to their current scores. This flowchart can be found in a legible form on page 4 of the risk management SOP, which is linked on the PowerPoint slide. You can also find links to this on the beat. Please note that if risk assessments are found not to adhere to the risk SOP, they will be returned to the draft stage by a member of the risk management team. The format, frequency and forum for for reporting and oversight of risks is determined by the type of risk, for example, strategic, corporate, care group or team, and the level of risk. Some risks require escalation, which means they will be subject to a greater level of oversight. The residual, current risk score will determine how a risk will be managed and escalated from ward or team to management group. This can be seen in the table on the following slide. Low scoring risks, those scoring from 3 to 5, are managed at a service level by the risk owner, and assurance will be provided to the senior risk owner on the management of these risks. They must be reviewed at least every 6 months at specialty or department level. Moderate risks, scoring 6 to 9, are also managed at a service level by the risk owner, and assurance will be provided to the senior risk owner on the management of these risks. The risk owner will provide assurance to the care group management team that the risk is being adequately managed. These risks are reviewed at least every 3 months. Serious risks, those scored 10 or 11, are managed by the risk owner with close support and oversight from the senior risk owner. Assurance will be provided by the risk owner on the management of the risk to the care group management team and relevant trust management groups. These risks must be reviewed at least once a month. Finally, significant risks scored 12 to 15 are considered to be serious threats to the organisation and are managed on a day-to-day basis by the risk owner and senior risk owner. These risks must be reviewed monthly by care group and corporate management teams, with the reports on these risks being presented to the hospital leadership team and its management groups, and also the group on a monthly basis. Please note, risks that are live on the risk register that have their current score increased to 12 or above must be escalated to the most appropriate chief officer and to the risk management team. This is to ensure the correct level of oversight for a newly arising significant risk. In line with the Norfolk and Waveney Group Policy for Risk Management, all risks are monitored against the following key performance indicators: the number of serious and significant risks, those scoring 10 to 15, not reviewed monthly, the number of risks which are overdue for a review, the number of risks with a control score of 4 or 5, the number of risks with open actions past their target date, and the number of unapproved risks which are to move to approved within 2 months. As previously mentioned, risks are recorded and reviewed on the Trust's risk management system, InPhase, which hosts the Trust's risk register. Part 2 of the Level 2 risk management training provides a comprehensive explanation of the use of InPhase for the administration of risk, but in essence, creating a risk assessment involves completing a form on the InPhase system with a section for each part of the risk management process. In addition to the information provided in this presentation, there is also a useful document entitled Risk Assessment Checklist to support you with assessing and managing risk. An extract of this document is shown on the slide, and the full checklist is available on Trust Docs or via the risk management page of the BEAT. Once a risk has been added to the risk register, close monitoring will be required to ensure identified actions are working to strengthen controls and to provide assurance that the risk is being managed appropriately. Risks scoring 10 and above will be reviewed regularly at team and care group meetings, but all risks, no matter their score, require timely review. It is Trust policy that risks are reviewed according to the timeframe shown in the table on this slide. However, you can update a risk at any point before the due date if there are developments or changes to report. You will be required to review and update your risk on the InPhase system. The Risk Review Checklist document provides a useful guide to carrying out a risk review and is available on Trust Docs and the BEAT. The content of this document is shown over the next 2 slides. When reviewing a risk, please ensure that you address the following. Controls. Check that all listed controls are still in effect and add any new controls that are now in place following the completion of actions. Current score. The current score of the risk should be reviewed regularly. Over time, with the completion of actions and strengthening of controls, It is expected that the risk score will become lower. However, there are circumstances where a score may be raised. Actions. Where gaps in control exist, actions should be identified to close these gaps. Completion of actions should strengthen existing controls or add new controls that reduce the likelihood of the risk materializing or the impact if it does. The action plan should provide a clear map of the journey from current to target score. Please provide updates on the progress of existing actions and add further actions as appropriate. And please correspond with action owners to chase timely completion of actions when necessary. Current status. Provide an update on the current position of the risk. This update should be about the risk itself rather than the administration of the risk record. Risk review comments such as risk reviewed are not sufficient, and the risk owner will be asked to add further detail in such cases. In addition to all these areas of review, do please check if the risk is still live or whether it can be archived. If archiving a risk, please provide the rationale for this within your status update. On this slide is an overview of the responsibilities of a risk owner. A risk owner is responsible for the following: reviewing the risk regularly, documenting reviews, chasing action owners for action updates and the timely completion of actions, adding new controls and actions to the risk record where appropriate, documenting changes in context, scoring and controls on the InPhase record, escalating the risk where a significant increase in score is required, ensuring the reporting of the risk to relevant groups and committees. We have now reached the end of the first part of the Trust's Level 2 risk management training. The second part relates to the use of the InPhase system for the administration of risks. Don't forget that access to all risk training materials, including this presentation as a slide deck with links to the videos and other materials that are included in the presentation, is via the risk management section of the BEAT. For ongoing support with risk management, please contact us at inphaseteam@nnuh.nhs.uk or visit the risk management page of the BEAT for the contact details of individual personnel. Once you have completed Level 2 Part 2, you will be directed to a quiz. A score of 80% or higher will be required for access to the InPhase risk module. Thank you for the time you have given to the completion of this training.